I'd like to give a quick introduction to our moderators for today's panel discussion. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Heidi Hayes-Jacobs. Heidi is the founder and president of Curriculum Designers. She has helped schools and other organizations create modern learning environments and update curriculum and support teaching strategies for over 30 years. Her models on curriculum mapping and curriculum design have been featured in more than 13 books and software solutions around the world. Thanks, Heidi, for joining us today. Please also give a warm welcome to Dr. Marie Hubley-Alcock. Marie is the founder and president of Learning Systems Associates. She has worked in public and private education as a teacher, administrator, and public advocate for the last 25 years. She has written more than 10 books on curriculum, instruction, and assessment design, and her focus has been working with schools to improve student achievement, multi-purpose mapping, and instructional practices, and more. We're also thrilled to have our panel of education leaders with us today. We are joined by Jennifer Mitchell, who is the superintendent of Huntingdon Area School District in Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us, Jen. Can you take a moment and share a little bit more about yourself and your role with curriculum mapping at your district?
Good afternoon, everyone. Sure. I am actually at my home district, close to where I live now. Prior to that, I have served as a teacher, primarily in kindergarten. I enjoyed little ones, so that's where I've spent most of my teaching career. I have been an elementary principal, and then I also worked in the central office at 2 other districts doing curriculum and professional development. And then most recently, since November, have been here as the superintendent.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. We are also joined today by Michael Broach, the Vice Principal of Academic and Student Services at Bishop Kenny High School in Florida. Michael, can you share a bit about yourself and your role with curriculum mapping?
Sure. Good afternoon. So I'm joining from sunny Florida here at a Catholic College Prep High School. I've spent the last 20 years in education, 18 on the faculty here at Bishop Kenny, which is also my alma mater, and 6 years in administration, though I do still continue to teach a class. It is the best part of my day. And in the administration, I helped pilot our curriculum mapping initiative about 6 years ago, and I continue to oversee curriculum at our school.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today. Lisa DeGaudio is also joining us today. She is the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at New Dawn Charter Schools in New York. Hi, Lisa. Can you introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. I have been a teacher for over a decade, and I moved into curriculum and instruction and open to transfer charter schools in New York City. So we have a campus in Queens and Brooklyn, and my passion around curriculum is really developing engaging materials for our students that are at risk.
Great, thank you. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Daniel Gallant, the Supervisor of Education Technology at Middlesex County Vocational and Technical Schools in New Jersey. Hi, Daniel. Can you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. So my role is an educational technology supervisor in our district. I work in our curriculum instruction or instructional services department. And so a lot of what I do revolves around assisting that department do all that stuff with curriculum mapping, which is how I ended up here with Chalk. I've been a teacher for 16 and administrator for my 4th year. So been in the industry for a long time, and yeah, and I appreciate this invitation to this panel.
We're happy to have you and everyone else here today. So thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. Without further ado, I'll hand things off to Heidi and Marie to get things started.
Thank you so much. Marie and I are just delighted to be with this group. We've had the good fortune of spending a little time in preparation with them, and you're in for some very, very important and insightful discussion points. So we wanted to start by really just looking at something a lot of people are curious about, and that is what propels people to begin mapping. And in your case, what was not working that you needed to attend to, or what were some of the reasons that you and your faculty, or maybe it wasn't even your whole faculty, maybe it was part of it, but what got you started? What were the points that got you launched into your mapping? And we'll talk about motivation later, we just want to know what initially drew you. And so would anyone like to speak up first on that? Or should we just do a round robin? Who's willing to start?
Sure, I'll jump in.
I knew you would.
So as far as an impetus to get started, we already had somewhat of a core group of teachers who were dedicated to that idea of really sitting down with the curriculum, pulling it apart and putting it back together, and going all in on this whole curriculum mapping concept, and every year coming back to it and reiterating it. But the issue we had getting going in our district was that was the extent of the drive and the interest was that core group. So what we had to do was look at ways to push beyond that group and try to bring the rest of not only the teachers, but the administrators as well in along for that ride. So that's where our struggle started and what we've been pushing through over the last few years.
Great. Do you want to go on, Jennifer, add to your perception on this?
Sure. Well, I had been selected by my superintendent to move into the central office, and he saw the very important role of curriculum in his district, a fairly large district, and he did not have a curriculum coordinator and hadn't had one for, I think, upwards of almost 10 years. And so he saw the opportunity to get that position, and he moved me in it, and he said, go. And I said, okay, here we go. And so I started pulling from my background of curriculum development and knew that mapping was the way that I wanted to go. And so, you know, I've read many of your books and work related to mapping, and just started to try and think about how was the best way to get going with staff, and where did I even start? And so mapping was the way for us to be able to take on a very large project in the district.
Lisa?
Kind of to jump on to what Jennifer was saying, opening our charter schools, we have to create a whole curriculum. And we have to ensure that it's state aligned, and we have to present that before we even get a green light to think about opening our doors and start recruiting students. So, putting that together and starting with a roadmap was extremely important for us, and to ensure that, as we were recruiting teachers and bringing them on board, they would also be of the same mindset that, having a roadmap and getting people on board to do that would be extremely important for the livelihood of the school. And so for us, opening with that mindset was extremely important. And so we were sort of at a benefit. Our Brooklyn campus is 10 years old now, but at the beginning, 10 years ago, just starting that, it's very hard to recruit with people knowing that you're a basic pioneer along, because you're setting a curriculum that's going to be used and revised over time. And so it's a very large undertaking at that point, but the revision process then becomes easier once you have people in it and really married to it, because it's part of their work too.
So far, I'm hearing 3 related but different portals into starting. I'm curious, Michael, about you.
So I really approached it as a classroom teacher. As a teacher, we had unit plans that were Word documents stored on our internal server. They were clunky, they were cumbersome. And frankly, a lot of teachers, they just had them saved because they had to check the box, but it didn't really reflect what was happening in the classrooms. And so about 6 years ago, as I was joining the administration and kind of tied into an accreditation visit that said, we need to really see evidence of what's happening in the classrooms. That's what really started it. But as we started the process, we wanted to find a platform that would be useful and that would be user-friendly for our teachers, and that they would find valuable, because that's the most important piece. You can write nice, pretty curriculum, but if the teachers don't find it valuable, then it sits on a shelf or a digital shelf.
One of the things that is coming out of this that I think I'm noticing, I'm assuming Marie's seeing the same, is mapping doesn't come in a vacuum. It won't work by just saying, thou shalt map. That's not going to work. But in each instance, there was a challenge or a problem, a presenting issue, and they're different from one another. But it's important to out that and make that public. And then people will participate when they know it's useful, when this is going to be an end to that. Marie?
I want to thank everyone for starting us off into this conversation. And I know we're going to talk about some of the groups that you mentioned and how to lead it. But even before we get into that area, one of the commonalities as we approach curriculum mapping is the calibration of language, the definition of curriculum. And very often we get different reactions to that and different assumptions that teachers and parents and even leadership might have about what curriculum is, what instruction is, and what a curriculum map would be. Could you share with us a little bit about your experience with the use of that terminology and how you went about addressing it or approaching it as a system? Who'd like to start?
I could start on that one because I think one of my favorite things is almost like using the telephone analogy. Because, you know, when you're in a classroom and you're in an engaging lesson, and then you have the kids that derail you, so you start at point A and then you're at point B, now you're off road, like that's what happens. And so if you don't have something to route you back in, then you're going to be off roads and it's going to be a whole different story. And you get to the end of the year and it's like, well, why do the kids do so poorly on this test? And it's like, well, you didn't teach any of the standards aligned to it. So of course that's why it happened. So I think that for us was one of the big things, is to avoid that situation.
And I'll add that I think I have the luxury of actually using chalk. I'm getting ready to start it in my new district, but I had an experience at my initial district just getting it started. And then I moved to another district. And I think what I realized was, and what I did in my second district was exactly what we're speaking about. Before I ever did anything, one of my professional development modules and training with all of the staff was, when we say the word curriculum, what do we mean? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What do we do when we talk about curriculum or curriculum mapping? And so really getting that terminology and that language out in professional development before I ever began the work in my second district was a real learning experience from my first district to say, okay, I didn't have to back up the bus. We started right away from the beginning saying, let's all get on the same page with what we understand and what we know about curriculum.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Lisa, thank you.
Yeah, so I can echo the same. We definitely had some misconception there. And when you go to certain either teacher or administrator, you know, you still get the thing where, well, we use this textbook.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but no, the textbook is not the curriculum, and we have to, yeah, exactly. And we all know, but I think once we started using it, which is something that Chalk helped us really push more forward with, the doing part of using the curriculum app and revisiting it and using it and revisiting, let people really see in action what it means to curriculum app and how valuable it is. So I think, although some of that was there in our district, once we hit the ground running, you know, people got it at that point.
Thank you, Daniel.
Well, to Daniel's point, we had something similar where I had to convince people to get away from saying that's in chapter 3, because that may change. What are we teaching? But to echo what Jennifer and Lisa were talking about of the overall big picture in the map, when I first used the term curriculum map, I had some big eyes going, is this something new, something different, something extra? And I said, think of it as when we watch the kids at graduation walk across the stage and get their diploma, what are they walking away with? So what we're doing in this is we're putting together the pieces that show what our kids will learn, the content and skills from the time they enter our doors until the time that they leave. And that really, I think, helped people to make sense of what the whole purpose of this was.
Marie, can I just respond to a couple points here? A couple of things I've heard. First of all, I think it's good that you've put on the table the textbook issue, but I think maybe we should touch base on this a little bit for the group listening. Textbooks are not curriculum, they're books. They can be a good spine. And not all textbooks are the same. Some are highly programmatic. There's a pedagogy. If I go with something like Go Math, there's a pedagogy, sort of the Singapore math model, that I could use as a spine that I will be laying out across a year. But it hasn't been written for my kids or Lisa's kids, or it's for anybody's kids. So we'll be making adaptation. Some curriculum, some people will say, well, we have an anthology. I'm going, that's great. What are you going to do with it? What will be the actions that will be taken with it? You know, we chose these books. That's great. But the books aren't the curriculum. You know, Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, but he didn't say the curriculum of Hamlet. You can teach Hamlet really poorly. So I think one thing to do is I would coach to not make teachers feel defensive about textbooks, to go in the line of what you're talking about. Let's just clarify what they are. Chapter 3, I don't even know what, I sometimes wonder if people even know what it's about. You know, it's what is it about? What is the curriculum in it? So I think there's a way to play that, respect it, but also not be bowled over by it so people aren't just plopping it in the curriculum. And the only second point was, someone mentioned this, and I thought it was really important. Mapping is a verb. It's a review process. I think it was you, Daniel. That is a really important point. So it's using the maps. Thank you all.
And also to respond to one more point that you brought up, that was you really dove into several aspects. One of you mentioned how having a software, having Chalk, really helped with that clarification. The distinction between instructional planning. So Chalk has an entire area that's going to be talking about lesson planning and instructional choices. And then it has a separate area that's going to be talking about curriculum documentation and curriculum maps, but they're not the same thing. I think that is a space that we can get stuck on. Well, is this going to replace my lesson plans? Is this going to replace my unit plan? What is this tool and how are we going to use it? So I think that there can be tools that inherently support us in that. And then, Michael, you brought up the idea of content and skills, that there's terminology even within our terminology. So once we understand curriculum, that there's terminology within that, the content, the skills, what do I accept as evidence or my assessments, that we also have to have clarification on. So something where any professional educator could read our maps and understand it and understand what our curriculum choices are in that moment becomes very important within the system. Just like architectural maps can be understood by any architect. We don't even have to understand the same language as in a speaking language, but we can understand the symbolism and the tools on an architectural map. That is the goal with a curriculum map. It's not something where I could have the English department document it one way and a math department document it a completely different way and say that we're going to be successful in our conversations. So, Michael, thank you for bringing that up, that this calibration of language conversation actually has layers to it. Heidi.
Yeah, I think we'll move on to the question. Another question about, I think the last point about architecture is interesting because architects actually all share the same terms. They may speak different world languages, but they all know what scale is. They all know what style is. They all know what perspective is. And any architect in the world can read another architect's blueprint. Anyone here read music? How many of you read music in this group? Okay. You can read notation, the same notation. I don't care whether you speak French, Italian, Bulgarian, whatever you speak, Chinese, Mandarin. The point here is it's because it's the same symbol system and everyone knows what it represents. But look at all the different types of music. Look at all the different types of blueprints. So one thing, a subtle point, is sometimes teachers go, oh, mapping, you're going to tell me what to teach, as opposed to, no, this is a way you're going to be able to share what you're working on in teaching that everyone else can understand. We don't all have the same blueprint, but we can read each other's blueprint. And so I think that is a very important point. Could we discuss for a minute something that comes up all the time, and that is how you got your staff motivated? Did you get involved with a small group first, like a task force group, or did you go wide? You know, the involvement of faculty is so important. Any stories to share here, or that would be great. Who wants to start us?
Sure. We, like I had mentioned in one one of the last points, we had that core group of teachers who were into curriculum mapping and curriculum development. But pushing beyond that group was our challenge, which is something our launching of Chalk helped us get over and start moving past. But one thing that we definitely made sure to do was beyond that group, we pulled in stakeholders from different parts of the district, administrators and whatnot, in that initial group beyond our core teachers who are committed to the curriculum mapping, to be part of that initial trial and launch. And, you know, does this work for us? Do we see its value before we launched further? We took a whole year before really going big with it, of testing and trialing and stakeholders, talking to principals and assistant principals and other departments. So it definitely took those stages to get there. And it wasn't like a light switch, like, hey, you're all going to do this now and it's going to be great.
Lisa, you started, thank you, Dan. There's a lot in what you just shared. Lisa, you started some schools. Did you get off and running starting with mapping, or did it come later?
Well, we did get up and running because we didn't have a choice. I mean, we, you know, mandated by the state to have a map system. So we used one, and it was not very user-friendly. And so going back to Daniel's points about bringing staff on, when we knew we were going to have to make some changes, it was easy to bring people on to say, all right, so we have to move everything over to a new platform. So why don't you come on and let's, you know, form a committee and make some decisions about what platform we're going to use. And that's how we arrived at Chalk. And so it was a lot easier because we had a group of people involved. It was a small group, 5 people, to take a look at that. And then, you know, when we expanded to our second school, you know, it was a lot easier to bring those folks on. We chose this because it's user-friendly. We can share plans. We can make changes. I mean, everything happens right in the system, whereas before it was just, I mean, it was a bear. We had to upload, download, make comments, re-upload. Like, there were so many steps in between that teachers were just exasperated and tired for the review process when I came in to do review as a principal, because, you know, it wasn't just, oh, let me just read these comments, make some changes, and then say, okay, I'm done, take a look. Whereas in Chalk, I can leave some changes, they can respond, they can share plans, they can share resources. It's just so rich and happening in real time that we can just make those shifts. And that ease, even for our not so tech savvy folks, has become so much easier to overcome. And I think a lot of it is wrapped around that, being able to like use the system. Like we've been talking so much about like the, you know, the idea of curriculum and what it is and everything. It's like, we're giving them the car, right? So we're giving them the thing to drive forward. And so if it's a good car, then we can move forward and do lots of cool things and go to lots of cool places. But if it's a jalopy, we're not going very far, right? So this is where we got the buy-in, is that we've got like a nice car, we're going to go places, and we're going to, you know, take this off-road and try this out and make changes. And it's a lot easier to do when you know that there's a lot less stress involved with that process. And so that's how I've been able to like move forward with things, even if, you know, getting critiqued, even for me, getting critiqued, even how I give my feedback is critiqued. At least I know we can make those shifts, and there's no, you know, like there's no issues. You know, we're here to make it better and work better. And so there's a lot of buy-in from that because we've had folks involved from the beginning on that.
Both you and Daniel referenced the importance of this sort of core group of, in a sense, teacher leaders, whether they were formally called that, engaged. They own it. They you know, they get it. You've been in several places, Jennifer, where you've sort of taken your skill set. Has that been true for you too, that you've relied on a core group of teachers? Did you have to cultivate it? Kind of, you know, each story so far has been a little different. But have you found that to be an incredibly important part, or it's good, but it isn't necessary? What have you found?
Yeah, I always think of, you know, if you look at the work of Cotter and the change process, he talks about this guiding coalition, right? You have to have a guiding coalition. And so all 3 of the districts that I'm in are very different, but what has been the same for me has been willing and interested staff who, whether they realize it or not, are really leaders. So it's that grassroots kind of movement that gets going. And they're also that group that feel a challenge in some way or have a question. So I would sometimes use data too to look at, well, where are we having challenges and difficulties in this particular district? And where are people feeling that frustration? Because when there's frustration, then there's that willingness to say, well, we're willing to look at it through a different lens. So what do you have, and how can we make this better? And so it's always, where can you get that high leverage? But it always started with a very small group. Here in my new district, for example, I have an English department who, as soon as I got here, it came through me. The principal came and they said, we're really having a hard time motivating our students to read, to write, to engage with literature at all different levels in our high school. Can you help us with that? And so this is the group that I'm going to start with this summer on really looking at curriculum mapping and how do we make those changes, because they're very highly motivated to find a solution. And now we can use curriculum mapping to show them the possibilities. And then what I typically would do is, once I had successful maps, now I can take it to the next group and say, look at this sample or evidence of how another group took on their challenges. What questions or what things do you want to see get better in our instruction and teaching? And now we can apply that to mapping.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. Michael, how's it been for you that way too? I mean, we've got Jennifer, who's been semi-nomadic, moving from different districts. In all due respect, sounds like you've done a great job setting up shop in each of them. But you've been at one place for a long time, and sometimes that's different. There's a different. And you, Lisa, you've been up and starting. You're doing startup stuff, and I'm curious for you. How did you get the motivation and the interest? Was it because it's an intimate environment that you know very well? I'm just curious about that.
Sure. Well, our accreditation visit 6 years ago, where they said we needed something better, that helped kind of get the conversation going. But you're right, it was different. We have a lot of teachers here that have been here more than 20 years. We have one right now that's been here for 41 years. And she said to me, well, I've seen a lot of these systems come and go. So really we started, as with many of you, with a small focus group of teachers. So before we even committed fully to chalk, we piloted chalk with just a focus group. And it was from that group that represented it was younger teachers, more veteran teachers, teachers from different departments. They started building things out and gave me feedback on what they wanted the unit template to look like, for example. And so that's really how the buy-in started, is that we spent basically a school year deciding, how do we want to go about this? So that then when we launched the next school year, we said, now we're going to do this, and we're going to do this for 2 years to build out our curriculum, not just copy and paste things over, but be purposeful in how we do it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And this idea, we're going to return to this idea about groups, and also, Jennifer, what you spoke about in terms of having genuine purposes and the different purposes for really going after mapping. But I know that we do have a lot of people listening right now, and we are going to pull from some of the questions that we're starting to get in the Q&A. But one burning question Heidi and I get all the time, and I was hoping to hear from you with your experiences, is a little bit about timelines. So if I'm going to go nice and slow and go from small group to small group, like Jennifer, you were mentioning, right? What kind of timeline are you planning for and thinking about? Or Michael, when it comes from the, you have to get this done and your next review is in 2 years, right? So how did timelines impact your work? And, is there any funny story you can give us about kind of what you thought your timeline was, or maybe what it became? Can you give the people listening a little bit of guidance from your experience about how to treat timelines?
I think you have to be realistic, right? I mean, we were talking about this before. when we moved from our old system to chalk, you take a look at what you have and you get started. And, for us, it was like, all right, so this is sunsetting in June and we need something, summer, September. So I'm like, we've got it. I can write it in 3 months. It's, we've got all this. We've done so many changes. Yeah, right. No, not 3 months. Try 6. We got through our first semester of courses, and then I just knew that our spring was not going to be ready in that same amount of time. Not because you're rushing to get it done, but when you're looking at things and it's like, oh, we need to align that better to this standard, and this didn't work so well. And I remember how this course rolled out. That wasn't great. So then you start, even though you're not in revision necessarily, you're still in revision. So you're making those changes. And so the timeline changes. And I think that with anything that we do, if we want to do it well, there just needs to be a timeline with the expectation that it's probably going to take at least 6 months to a year for something that's going to be quality. And with the expectation that revisions should be made on the ground as it's being rolled out and teachers are using it, because they're going to say, I need more time for this unit, or I need more time for this, or this resource didn't work so well, so that you can make those changes so that it makes sense. And so I think that, for a lot of people, when we talk about like the bureaucracy and everybody like breathing down your necks about, oh, this can be done in X amount of time, if you really want it done well, you have to come into it very flexible, very humble, and just ready to get it done with quality and with everyone on board. And if you could approach it in that way, then there's a lot more flexibility in getting things accomplished.
Okay, Lisa, thank you. So what I heard there, though, were some pretty concrete times, right? 6 months to a year. Daniel, were you thinking of adding to that piece?
No, we ran with roughly the same amount, about a year. And we have new standards coming in New Jersey right now that will be due in a year from now when our school district ends up under review again. So we've left ourselves that runway of time to make sure everything we want is in place where it should be. So yeah, I would definitely second that timeline.
Thank you. Michael, or Jennifer.
Sorry. I would just say that, I think we talked about mapping as a verb.
Yeah.
And so it's doing, right? And I think I've been in different places. And so those timelines have been different in different places based on the resources we have, based on the amount of people that I have. One thing that I was really honest about with my school boards, from an administrator point of view, with my principals, with even the teaching staff, is that we can't rush this. We have to do it well. And there will be timelines put on us. The next review that's coming up, the state's telling us our standards have to be aligned by a certain date. And those are realities. But I think we have to be very careful to make sure we use common sense and balance. Because if we do that, the mapping process will simply become that checklist of things to get done. And we talked about putting it on the shelf in a way. So, one of the things that I tried to do to help teachers with that was we would build curriculum for 6 months to a year, like building an actual, like my English department, for example, might take 6 months to a year to build it. Then they're ready to teach it the following year. And we teach it approved in draft format. And that's very important when I take that and that language, because then they know that second year I'm teaching, I'm going back in, I can make revisions. It's okay to do that. Nobody's going to be upset with you. And then after that full second year, then we will take it and we'll say, okay, we're going to publish this as curriculum that we all are not going to make some changes to unless there's a real need, or we're going to come back to a review cycle with. So that kind of gave almost a 2-year process, truly, which sounds like a really long time, but I think it's well worth the time spent.
No, I thank you for that. The idea of the cycle. Some of us are very familiar of a review cycle, 5 years, 3 years, whatever that idea is. And when we talk about timelines, what I'm hearing you bring forth, there's 2 or 3 or 4 different types of timelines. Maybe there's the timeline for getting initial information, documenting some curriculum, right? Getting it into a database. And then there's this timeline for planning and having conversations about what's in that database or examining samples of student work. And that's where we start to get this term curriculum mapping never ends. But I think sometimes that might be the most misunderstood term because people are like, I know, because we constantly have to redo it, or, oh my gosh, because we're putting it in a new system. But it's really, Jennifer, what you were getting at there, which is now I'm into a cycle that doesn't have to wait 5 years. I could even be in a cycle that's perpetual. Michael, did you want to add some pieces to this about that timeline, especially when you're referencing someone with 41 years?
Yes. Well, when we started this process, I gave kind of goalposts of we want to do just this by this date. We timed them around our professional development days so we could actually give teachers the time. But I also knew that we had to be flexible. So we made adjustments along the way. For example, our Spanish teachers were going away from one textbook series and going to a new platform, which was much more rigorous. But they weren't sure what that was going to look like, but they all had an agreement of what they wanted to do with world language here at our school. So they said, can we wait a little bit and start working on just level 1 Spanish? And we're just going to work on Spanish 1 and see where we can realistically get so that then we can plan what Spanish 2 looks like, then 3, then 4. Well, now all 4 levels are planned out and they're very happy with where they're able to get the students. Math standards here in Florida are changing next year. And so right now I have one lead math teacher and she's working with all the others to come up with, let's rework how we do all these units in math because we're finding kids with more math difficulty, especially in the COVID era. So they want to rework a little bit of Algebra 1 and as it builds into higher math courses, basically using the new standards as the justification to start moving things around. So I like that it's always a continual process and it's not just there, it's done, it's saved, and we can move on.
Actually, I'd like to piggyback that and just there's 2 quick points. One is I think it's real important to start off by changing the view of curriculum as something that's finished.
Right.
We certainly wouldn't want our medical profession to say, oh, we're done with breakthroughs. No more of those. I mean, there's always going to be something new to learn, and you're going to have new kids and new tools. And instead of making it rough, you say, and I love the phrase draft, it's always iterative. It's always a draft.
Right.
You'll have some fundamental things in place. You're not going to have to overhaul everything. That's what I think you're messaging, Jennifer. Relax a little bit. But you get to update it. You get this opportunity, which I think was something that you were expressing, Michael, I liked a lot. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but when you started going, I went, oh my gosh, here's the question that I have so many principals ask me. They aren't so concerned about the long-term goals. They're trying to find the minutes and the time during the course of the year when teachers can actually make headway, especially these days. That comes up more than almost any other question. Isn't the big goals, but how do we actually get there given the demands of time? Well, maybe we have 3 professional development days. You're not going to get a lot done there. Do you have any thoughts on that? That would be a very big question.
What we did for our professional development days, we scrubbed a lot of the ordinary meetings and said, we're just going to we booked the computer labs, for example, when we first got this started, and we assigned the departments into the labs. And then those of us on our administrative team, we hopped in between the labs to help and coach and guide and answer questions. And some said, we really want to rethink this before we get this part started. Great. And then it was neat because some of them went off to lunch together and then they went to their classrooms. And it's nice because especially in a high school setting, we have multiple buildings. It really helps to break down the barriers of the classroom walls because it got teachers to finally start talking about what it is that they teach. So they were having conversations about what happens in their classrooms, and it was really, really nice. So we just made it a priority to, if we don't absolutely have to have a meeting, let's give teachers the time, but structure it so that, it's time well served.
And I would like to build on that. I mean, I had that aha moment. I was the person who built professional development for the district, right? And so we always come up with all these topics and we never have enough days. But what my largest understanding became was curriculum mapping is professional development. And it's time so well worth spent, right? So instead of trying to come up with all these brand new ideas and we're going to have a session on this and a session on that, it's just simply we're getting together. Like Michael said, I'm providing you that time and opportunity for discussion and work around developing curriculum. And that's the most important part of the work that we do. Not to say that we don't have to learn new things or strategies and those types of things, but coming here, we're going to get ready to plan for professional development. And that's what I said to my principal team. If we build in time for curriculum development, professional development should take care of itself.
I want to thank you for all those pieces. We do have a quick question. Some people were just wondering about staffing numbers. Real briefly, could you give us a sense of your staffing numbers as we've given some of these examples and answers? And then we're going to go into a discussion about these, your initial challenges and successes. So would anyone just be willing to quickly share around those pieces? And then Heidi, did you want to add on?
Marie, I think what we're going to do, I got a quick note from Chalk. We'll finish up your last point, and then they'd like us to go.
Yeah.
Sarah's going to read the questions from the group because of the time.
Oh, okay. I just thought because people were responding to it, I figured I'd answer that. No problem. Okay, then why don't we launch into the discussion about your experiences, and this could be either in the school that you're in now or in your previous experiences, with specific successes that you had, what worked well, what really maybe turned the tide for you, or initial challenges, things that were presented to you as barriers and challenges, and how you went about addressing those. If you could be as specific as possible, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So, sorry. Our biggest challenge was the one that we kind of started this conversation with, where you had your committed group who wanted to see the change, and then that document got distributed and it ended up in the draw for the majority of teachers and administrators in the district. But I think our success was coming into this specific digital platform, Chalk, where we could demonstrate its value daily with the teachers and the principals so they could see how valuable the work that was being done actually was to them. And that's actually let us grow that first core group into a much larger group who want to see change happen with their curriculums.
I was going to jump in and say for us, the biggest challenge is the nature of our group. So, our schools are focused on at-risk students. So they're all overage and undercredited, which means that, our ninth graders are 19 years old, 20 years old. And so the big part of our curriculum is actually work-based learning. So our students are face-to-face with us in content for 1 week, and then they're in workforce training and internships on the alternating week. And so for us, curriculum mapping is in itself the challenge, because we have to really make very, very strategic decisions on what we're focusing on while they're in front of us and what we expect them to work on when they're not in front of us, so that they're earning credits, but that they're also going to pass the Regents exams to graduate. And so that was initially a very large challenge, because we had to really learn how to chunk and prioritize the big pieces in the curriculum, but then also learn how to be able to put the brakes on in classes that are not at that Regents level, so that students have that chance to take a breath, because the Regents level courses are fast paced because they need to get to the finish line really quickly. So it's really finding a delicate balance of that academic rigor and meeting those responsibilities, but then also taking a step back and getting the social emotional pieces as well.
I think if I had to name my challenges, it's time, the number of staff that you might have. And you did talk about that. My first district, probably over 500 teachers, my middle district was about 300, and now my home district's about 160 teachers. So very differing, but how do you find that time? And really, I also, in my previous districts, that was my role. I was the curriculum director. And so I could devote a lot of time to that. But I know many of you may not have that. And some of you who are on this with me are not doing that either. You're teaching a class and you're doing lots of different things. So now for me, and the hat that I'm wearing now as the superintendent, I do not have a curriculum director, right? So I have to figure out who's going to do that work and how do I help my administrative team and my teacher leaders and myself to work through this whole process, and how do I get that work done now, because it does look very different for me in the current district.
I'll say for successes, it is very helpful for new teachers coming into the school. The biggest question they have is, what am I teaching? And so now they have a map that they can follow, and it makes them feel more comfortable to know, because, when I started teaching years ago, I was handed a thick textbook. This is what you taught. Well, as you know, all those things can change. So now it's nice to have a clear map, but also it's built on the collaboration of other professionals. So it helps to bring about those conversations. Also, we always have given common midterm and final exams among same subjects, but now this process has gotten teachers to start talking about how they assess. And now we're seeing more common assessment techniques and more common instruction happening in classrooms. Now, a challenge is sometimes that can be uncomfortable for teachers, right? They're used to doing things a certain way, and used to doing things, some are used to the way everything happens within these four walls. So that sometimes can be a challenge as well. And of course, the other real challenge is, as sometimes teachers leave and new teachers come in, it's always that continual process. So I think the biggest takeaway I have is it's okay if curriculum mapping is a little messy, as long as we're using it as a verb, that we're constantly in and thinking about what we're teaching and what our students are learning.
Thank you so much. That was perfect. Sarah, I want to make sure that we have enough time to do what you were planning there before we respond or go any further with that.
Yeah, I think we're getting some great questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure as soon as we start that, we'll get some more flooding in. So I figure, unless anyone has any final thoughts that they'd like to share just on the discussion we've been having today, now is your chance before we move to the Q&A.
I just want to, before we dive into those pieces too, is share that our focus this time really was the initial, right? The launching and the starting. And I'm already really looking forward to the next panel discussion, right? I have notes here for oh my gosh, we need to talk about, the different kinds of maps and all the things you've brought up. So I have deep gratitude to the range and depth of all the answers you've given. And if anyone who's listening is like, but wait, I wanted more on that, it is coming. So thank you for that.
There's also a point in there that you make that's important, and that is one of the reasons I think all of you began to talk about how you were using them, how you can address problems, you can inform your work on how kids are doing, you can carry out gap analysis, is because you're on the other side of it. You can begin to see it. When you're not on the other side of it, it's hard to convey that that's what's going to happen. So I think one of the things you can bring from this is where we want to be. 2 years from now, what kind of conversations do we want to be having? What kind of problems do we want to be able to address? And if people can begin to envision what that really looks like realistically, I think those same points will motivate them. Anyway.
One of the things we run into with the discussion of time is always in the beginning, it's when are we going to have time to complete maps or put maps in or put information in. And then after 2 years, it's always, when are we going to have time to have all the conversations we want to have? How do we get all these teachers together to have those conversations? And no one's complaining about actually putting data in the database anymore. Isn't that something?
I like that. Sarah, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So we have some fantastic questions here. So this one is from Casey. They ask, have any of you written a student-centered curriculum map versus a teacher-centered curriculum map? In other words, instead of teachers who are expected to cover this material within this specific time frame, but rather students are expected to be proficient on this concept or skill by this date.
I mean, I think we are to a certain degree because we're semester based. And so our students, we refer to the Regents as our Super Bowl. So we have 3 Super Bowls a year, in non-COVID living. And so for us, students have to meet those benchmarks to get there. So, in that sense, we are writing, and I talked about that earlier about like the chunking piece and the prioritizing, because there are very specific skills that students have to learn. And, I'm just recently finally get to see the US Regents that's coming out, because it's been delayed so much because of COVID. That's going to certainly change our approach to what we've been doing so far. We won't know what to change until we see how students perform on it. So, in that sense, students are very much at the center of what we do plan, so that, they're not losing time, because our students have a greater risk of aging out than, a traditional high schooler.
I don't have a specific one where it's the students have to achieve this, kind of like a scope and sequence of expectation.
Yeah.
But I will share something that is connected to the buy-in process. We had teachers who were intimidated by writing curriculum maps, and they were intimidated, especially about 8th graders, like that final semester, what are we going to do? How are we going to get rigorous activity? And we said, okay, well, let's have the students map. And the students wrote the curriculum. And I will tell you, one, students learn how to write curriculum very quickly, and they are very good at it. And number 2, when they actually looked at the curriculum that the students wrote, teachers actually teared up, because they said, and this is a population very similar, Lisa, to what you're describing, but they said that the students wrote a far more rigorous unit experience than what the teachers would have assumed the students could have done at that time. So if the question is, should we write student maps or can students write maps? My quick answer is yes. I would want to hear more about what the idea is about student achieving certain goals by a certain time. That sounds like a slightly different thing to me.
Jen, I think you were going to jump in at the start of that too. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, we tried to start with, I guess, what I would call non-traditional, like the ones, the courses that are requiring our state testing, right? Because people feel so locked into that. So I tried to start with my art programming or some of my STEM courses to allow teachers the flexibility to do that. And they kind of, they had a variety of standards that they were teaching in there, but they almost developed almost their own standard set to kind of make it more skill-based and very clear. And then we were also trying to get language in there to use that when we were speaking to students, what really were the objectives and the goals, and how did it look if the student was learning what we were asking them to learn, and what would they be doing. So I started with more non-traditional, and to your point, we did try to have some students give input on some of the maps more at the secondary level. And it's always curious and fun to let them see that.
Maybe I'm thinking that, first, I love these responses. I think this was, if you take the question as coming at how do we take the curriculum and make it very directed towards the learners we have, that's one way. But I actually heard it differently. My thought on it was, if it was a pedagogical question, like if you're in a school that is driven by student created narratives, like a high-tech high, or a big picture school, or a charter where students are really based on their career aspirations, then it is the students are developing the actual learning experiences and laying it out. You can map that. You can map it in just the same way you could map a traditional course and make it even better, which is a lot of what we're talking about here. So the fact that the origin of the content either can come from a student quest, or say an internship, or programs that are more phenomena-based, more emergent, a Waldorf school type thing, they can map it. It isn't, the pedagogy will determine how you do it, but the process applies to any situation. What I'm hearing us talk about is students are the clientele, so they should absolutely be at the center of what we do as we move forward.
Thanks, Heidi.
You're welcome.
We've mentioned buy-in a couple of times throughout today's session. Melanie has a question for sort of getting people to buy in again. So she says, my school has been curriculum mapping for around 10 years and we are about to be switching tools. There was a lot of grumblings about it because they did not like the old tool we use, which caused them to not like curriculum mapping. What would you suggest for getting buy-in again from the staff and getting them excited about it? We don't necessarily have a core group of people that are the go-to mapping people because our previous administration made us map nonstop for 8 years. Michael, I know you had a lot of people who had been there for a while in different processes, so maybe you can talk to this a little bit.
Right. And I was also thinking Lisa, because you were sharing a very similar experience when I read that question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it starts with being very transparent about what the objective is and then reassuring teachers that there's a realistic timeline. So when we first announced it, I said, we're going to take 2 years to do this, because our last time that we were given a new unit plan document 10 years ago, we were told this needs to be done in 2 weeks for a whole semester. And that was totally unrealistic. So when I said 2 years and I'm going to help you with it, and I'm going to be right there with you and we're going to work, even if it takes department by department, I just had to, I guess from a leadership standpoint, it's being very calm and reassuring. And it didn't take 2 years, it was 2.5. And that doesn't mean that every subject area was done in 2.5, because there is really no done. We had some that were in different places than others, and that's okay. And once we can kind of communicate that message to our teachers that this is an ongoing process and we want to do it right and we want it to be valuable to you as a teacher and purposeful, that's when we got the buy-in. And that's when everybody's anxiety lowered and their walls came down, and then they were willing to, work away at it.
Lisa?
I'm thinking about, I think Jennifer mentioned this earlier today when we were talking about like organizational frameworks, and I always thought about Peter saying and leadership and building capacity from within. And so for us, it was a lot of, when we first opened the Brooklyn School 10 years ago, it was me. And then, hiring people that would be on board to make changes. But we opened the second school and we all shifted to chalk. So it was a lot easier to bring people on and come at it from the perspective of, hey, we need to get a platform that's going to work for everyone, from the novice user to someone that's experienced with technology and comfortable with it. And then also, looking at what changes can we make to our maps and what's going to work better for our students, going back to the vehicle analogy. So it worked for us because it was a loose timeline. So we didn't say, I had my inner, I know I said 3 months, for us, we had a shorter timeline. We had things created already. But the idea was that we would take that time to make the revisions and put things in that worked and make those decisions. So by giving everyone that low stress, like, you're not going to get in trouble. We're not in trouble. Everything's fine. Let's just do this right. And, really reduce that anxiety and take it from the point of, what's going to work that's going to make the teacher's life easier. That becomes, it's an easier pill to digest, because now it's, okay, I'm going to do this. I only have to do it once. I can copy it for my next semester and then just go in and make those revisional changes for a lesson that I didn't necessarily like, or maybe we made the decision to change a short story for this unit or whatever the case is. You're not rewriting a lesson plan or rewriting a map. It's right already in chalk, and it's just an easy fix, couple of types, and we're done. And so that revision process and that standing of saying, oh, we're going to try this out and this is going to be our experiment semester to semester is a lot better than just, we have to do this and it's going to be this way. And if I don't like it, you're going to hear from me. It's not like that at all. And I think that becomes a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you both. Next question. I am at I believe this is Paula. I am at a private school who is just starting mapping with chalk. We have a great curriculum but we have never been able to follow a set of standards. Any idea where to advise my teachers about how and where to begin with mapping the standards? Dan, maybe you want to start us off?
Sure. Actually, it was, I think, something Dr. Jacobs said a long time ago that I heard her say that is always stuck in my brain, was that the standards were just something you grabbed all of and put in, and that's going to be your lesson. That the standards weren't the curriculum and the standards weren't your lessons, and it wasn't something you just grabbed them all and put them in. It was more of the guidance and where are you going with your content and your curriculum. And so thinking about it in a different lens like that, I think helps enter you into that space. And just that quote by Dr. James, I don't remember when I heard you say that, but that stuck with me for a long time.
I'll have to see if I can remember it too.
I agree, because I remember this when we started with Performance Plus a decade ago. And
Yeah.
it was, what do I want to learn and what do they need to do? You know, so that whole learn, do, content, and the verb situation that goes in and drives everything forward for sure.
Yeah. You know, standards are, to piggyback both your points, they're a ballast. They really aren't curriculum. They don't tell you what to teach, when to teach, how to teach, and what you're going to assess. But they're very thoughtfully organized. They're a taxonomy. They're a long list of proficiencies looking for a place to live and breathe in the school year. So the idea is, as Marie has done some brilliant work in this area, is unpacking them, bundling them, and placing them, but converting them into student-friendly, student-facing learning targets. So I think it's the marriage of these that really gives heft. And I guess the reverse question in response to it is, what happens if you don't have it? What is lost here? And their value. I'd be curious to hear from our group what they have found important and valuable about standards, and some of the ways people can not do such a great job with them. I'm kind of curious. We could open it up.
I have actually seen the opposite occur. Such a strong focus on the standards that they're in their way. Right? They can't get it out of their way, and they're trying to structure the map just around the standards, and it's prohibiting them from doing good thinking. And so sometimes, you know, I will, if I see people doing that, I have them set them aside and we just start having conversation, or as we talked about, unpack them, right? Unpack to really talk about what do they mean and what is the purpose, because they can overtake the work.
Yeah, I think it's an avoidance procedure sometimes. It avoids the curriculum. At their best, you know, I think the idea of the unpack, I think the conversion to the learning targets is the game changer, because you're not just covering them as a checklist, you're converting them into I can statements that can then give some power to the curriculum as a backbone. But it is not the curriculum. And I think clinging to those is a mirage almost, you know. I think it's a problem.
We've also been successful in describing those standards the way Heidi's talking about them with the learning targets as the minimum expectations. And so if the standards are the minimum expectations, and I can bundle them and lay them out in the year and say, okay, here are the guaranteed moments where we're going to get evidence of these and connect them to learning experiences, but that's the minimum. Maybe that's about 50% of my instructional time. So what else is going on? Curriculums always go above standard. If you come at it with that kind of a narrative, then you can start saying, oh, great, what are the contexts or case studies we're going to do? And then where are we going to personalize this or connect it to our community? And that opens up that challenge, right, to saying, oh, meeting the standard was all we had to do. In other words, standards are not limiters, right? They are the minimum expectations. That could be helpful.
Great.
I also think too, like just really quickly, like thinking about what do you want this to look like at the end? You know, and having that visual, or what is a final product that you would want someone to be able to create or develop on their own, independent of the teacher, you know, putting in that inquiry and that project-based learning piece of it. You know, if you're able to do that and set that vision, and hopefully the students will take it higher than that vision, you're giving that space for all learners to grow in very specific ways, right? Because you want to make sure that we're hitting everyone in there.
Mhm. Another quick question from Chastity. Would love to have staffing numbers shared when speaking of timelines. How many people working on the curriculum maps for 6 to 12 months? Is this for, K to 12 across the board or smaller sections in there? Jen, maybe you can talk to this just because you have had districts of different sizes where you've approached this. Sometimes, size of the school depicts how many people are involved.
Right. I mean, one of my elementaries, I had, 18 kindergarten teachers. 18 kindergarten teachers trying to write curriculum together will be a recipe for disaster. And I can say that because I was a kindergarten teacher. We needed to get some representation across all of my buildings and people with differing types of views. So I didn't always want to pull from the same group of teachers who had the same view, because they're going to write a curriculum, give it to the other members, and then say, here, teach what we believe, right? So that is hard to wrangle down because you want all stakeholders' input. So I think there's stages of that. So we would do it, but we'd bring it back, and then we'd have the 18 kindergartners and teachers in a room talking about it and discussing it and reflecting on it. And then that part about doing it, right? We're going to do it, and then we're going to get back together and we're going to talk about what worked and what didn't and what might need to change. I think in the secondary, you get it's a little easier because maybe we have this team of teachers all teaching a certain subject, or which tends to be smaller groupings, or these 2 classes. So I've had as few as 2 people working together, even a single person if they've got an elective course, to as many as, 6, 8 people in a room. And I always would also try to involve maybe my gifted support, my ESL teacher, a special education teacher. So you're getting varying views and opinions as well to the table.
That's great. A couple of you also mentioned that you started with more of a focus group and then brought more people in. Can you speak to how many people were in that initial focus group before you expanded and sort of brought more people into the curriculum mapping fold?
Sure. So we had something in the order of 20 to 25 teachers we could typically count on who were really devoted to this task. And then since over the last 2 years of running with Chalk, it's definitely grown to more in the 35 range. But beyond that, as to what was just brought up, it's now an easier conversation to have throughout the year with the professional learning communities and the departments across the whole district, where they're able to talk about what's been put there, discuss changes, and funnel that to those core groups when they come back to meet as those core groups again to continue that work. The one challenge we have as far as like groups and numbers is our district is a career and technical education district as well. And so we'll have, like you said, even a team of 1 in some cases, when that is the only person teaching that shop, like machine tool technology. There's just the one man who's trying to develop that curriculum all on his own. And I'm an ed tech person and a math and science. I can't assist him in his content, but he's the one who's got to run with that. And so timelines will differ depending in that sense.
Yeah, Sarah, one quick point here. I think the question I saw earlier, question on this, is 100% proportional. Marie and I have groups we work with. A large district in Texas has 35,000 students. They do it differently. They have building level teams, and then they have a district level group, and they have professional developers that lay it out. They have some common consensus maps, if you know what I mean, some agreed upon maps, and each school can play with those. That's a policy issue. Right now, I'm working with some schools in St. Louis with the Archdiocese there. And several of those schools have 1 teacher per grade level. 1. And then others are large. They got, I don't know if they have 18 kindergarten teachers, but they're heading in your direction over there. And the point here is, so when you look at a representative group, I think you want to start with the motivated for sure, always build from strength, but you've got to fill in your holes too. You've got to have representation, and you make it proportional to the size. And if you're in a really small school, then you are looking at the committee. Like if you got a teacher per grade level, you're it, the group. So I think that's an important piece, is it's who's on it as much. And remember, it doesn't have to be closed. You can invite people for certain sessions, or you want to look at the role of administrators. Some of you have department chairs. So you think both politically and strategically, but you don't want it to be top down. A couple of you, in fact, one of the questions that came up was like, it was dictated in our old, like, did any of you see that question? It was like, somebody came in and just told us what to do. That does not go over well. And so I think it's a fair question, but it's very much proportional, I would say.
Absolutely. And a little bit of what you're mentioning too is just the collaborative nature of curriculum mapping, because it very much is a collaborative process. Can anyone speak to sort of how you did that collaborative practice and making that process of curriculum mapping very much a collaborative process?
Once we got into it, and I know everyone on this panel has talked about it, but like PLCs are probably one of the biggest vehicles that we have used for buy-in, and specifically because folks can talk offline without us standing over, trying to solve problems and, whatever it is that we do. But they are able to like really get into the nitty-gritty of things and work through it and talk about it, and then come back and, have some real frank conversations about the things that are happening on the grounds. And I think that is probably one of the biggest things that work for our school culture across our buildings, that they can, hop on a Zoom across buildings, have a conversation, talk about some things, and come back and say, all right, so we've tried this, and we need some changes. Let's try this thing. I mean, there's a lot of different avenues, and it really frees up the space for them to kind of problem solve on their own, but also really, be thoughtful about the process and about the ways that students are thinking and engaging with it and interacting with each other with that material. So I think that that's probably one of the most valuable things that we set up as part of our structure for that.
Right. So Laura is also asking, how can we set up expectations regarding curriculum mapping for teachers which are realistic? She'd rather see them engaged well with less than not able to engage at all with too much.
I think we've all said over and over again, like small digestible bites works best. Teachers are tired, they're overwhelmed, they're constantly worried about something. And if you're just giving them 10,000 things that they have to accomplish, they're only going to do the one thing that they want to do, and it may not be what your priority is. So I think, setting reasonable goals that are bite-sized and small, that makes sense for everyone and is transparent. It's not just some arbitrary thing. I think probably works the best for it. So they really kind of culturally have to, test the waters with their group. What does your staff need? What do the students need? What are the communications? And then set goals from there.
I would build off of what Lisa's saying, in that one of the biggest, mistakes Heidi and I see is when people say, well, we'll get the maps, right? Let's complete the mapping, and then we'll start having the conversations. And I think that that's just overwhelming even to say out loud, and to say a clear purpose. What is the conversation I'm looking to have? What's the data I need to have that conversation? And that starts to guide them what maybe types of maps we need to collect, what kind of information we would need. I can even have half of my template blank, but still have a meaningful conversation if I guided it correctly. So that very clear purpose is going to be the most important aspect. Then the second piece that is a marriage to that is to differentiate this for your faculty. Some of them, and I've heard everyone kind of mention how they were doing that, but really try to think about this not as and all the teachers will do this by this date. I loved what you said. Well, here, my English department needs this, or maybe my art department needs this. And it may actually end up being more work than we initially thought we were ready to embrace. But if it's meaningful, it'll get done, and it'll get done with quality.
Let me add to that and give a really concrete action that we often take. When we first go in and a district asks us to work with them, everyone is the reason they're anxious is they want it to be perfect. I mean, you're all laughing because you know what I'm saying. They're like, oh my God, I can't do this. And I'm like, they get really nervous about it. So one thing we'll say realistically is let's slow down. We're just going to work with one unit. Okay, we've laid out the standards, perhaps we've done the bundling or pulled it. I love that I used to say that. Now that's going to be my new favorite thing, Dan. Pulled out those standards and bundled them and placed them. We're in a pretty good place to start, but let's all slow down here. Between now, let's say it was the first of the school year we started, say it was September 5th or something. By the end of the month, everybody's going to do a working draft. We've done some training on what goes into those elements in that template. We've given you models and samples so you can see what it looks like. We've got a rubric we've collaborated on, and you're going to get feedback. We're not asking you to have it in to have it finished, but draft exactly what you're saying, Jennifer. And the point that you were raising, Lisa, also is there's a clear reason for this. We've walked it through, and then you're going to get a lot of feedback. Go back over, make a few changes, and once you've got that confidence, you can begin to set some goals and move it along. It's when you feel like, oh my gosh, there's this whole year and I have to do it all. And you just say, no, you don't. And besides that, an ounce of prevention is worth a year of rewrites, to be perfectly honest with you. So start small, but here's a coaching point we'd also add. You probably want to start to develop a set of curriculum editors, feedback people, teacher leaders, maybe part of that group. So can you take a look at this for me, Daniel? Is this, so I know that what I'm doing, I have more confidence in, and then you can start to move it along. So it's not, the software is a platform. It's what you're putting into it that makes people a little nervous. So I would say start off with slow, small, meaningful moves, lots of feedback. Then you can set some realistic targets and differentiate, because it might be that English department's going to really shoot ahead now. It might have a group that moves more slowly. There might be, like with the new standards they're not even so new, next gen, but for Pennsylvania they are right now, is going to take more time so that you can differentiate the moves, but they can do it with a little more confidence. That, I don't know. I think, Marie, don't you think that's about right?
And I think the funny thing is when I've worked with groups, it's really interesting to watch them, right? It's that flexibility piece, and they'll wrangle and they'll get so overwhelmed by the map in itself. And it'll take them almost a half a day to kind of get their work structure and flow together. And I will watch different groups, like my people think differently, right? So when I'm working with my art department, they're sketching and drawing and doing all of these really amazing things so they can get their thoughts together and then put it into that map. My math folks are very analytical, and they want to be in that map and they want to do it this way. So it's really interesting to watch the groups depending on who you get together and realize that, and I heard Michael say, you don't just assign the work and run from them, right? You are working with them. Then I heard Lisa say, go away, let them have that private conversation, let them have that real talk. If you're that administrator or the person of authority, then come back and be that reflecting sounding board to assure them that, yeah, like this is work and it's not meant to be perfect. The fact that you're embarking on the work is enough right now, and then we'll continue to craft it.
Absolutely. Thank you. We did have a question submitted in the chat from Lori. She was asking, are there any guiding questions that help drive your curriculum mapping process? I suppose this could be either from the get-go or a more ongoing questions that sort of drive the process.
I would say when we started, it was about, one big picture. What is it that the content and skills that we want our students to come away with in 4 years in our school? But then in each department, I said, what are the most important things that students need to learn? Let's start there and just build that. And then let's just work on little pieces of building upon that. So in math, it was pretty clear because they know that they're scaffolding skills. In social studies, I remember they had a conversation and said, well, we cover this stuff in world history and this in US history. And my question back to them, being a history teacher, is, well, how many of you have your students read and analyze primary source documents? Well, that's all of them. Okay, let's start with that. Let's build those pieces into our curriculum. So really, I think it's good to start with the big picture of what is it we want our students to learn and come away with. And then that's how everything else, all the little content starts to fall into place after that.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And then just one final question. So Amanda says, our school had a curriculum director several years ago, but hasn't done anything with it since she left. We realized we need someone to do curriculum at our school, but cannot hire another director. So now we're developing a curriculum team of teachers to now lead this work. Would you suggest having this team use Chalk as a focus group, as someone on the panel mentioned before, or would that be a good starting place as we begin building this team? I know a couple of you sort of started the process and then moved to Chalk, so maybe you can talk a little bit about why you did choose Chalk and sort of when you moved to Chalk as well, sort of what stage in that process.
Sounds like the questioners where we were at, where we had those core teachers who had that team together that they formed and were devoted to that work, and then now they're considering moving to Chalk. The reason our district moved to it was to expand on that verb of curriculum map and have that be sort of something that kept coming around and that reached everybody in the district, whereas before it wouldn't. So I would definitely encourage them to do something that will up that collaborative nature in their district, so that will bring more teachers into the process, so that they'll have the resources of the rest of that human capital in their district with them, because they're not the only ones in their district. There's, I don't know how big the questioner's district is, but that's something that affects all of them. And so putting in place something that will bring more in is definitely something they should be looking at and considering.
Great. Would anyone else like to chime in on that? Okay, well, I think we're pretty much done here. That's all of our Q&A questions for today. Does anyone have any final thoughts that they'd like to share with each other or the attendees?
I just want to thank everybody. Just such a pleasure and an honor to be around this table. I have learned a lot alongside you, and also the participants, the people who joined us, asked so many good questions. And also thank you to Chalk. Sarah, you have such a calm, easy presence, and you organize this just beautifully. So thank you. And as always, I love to work with Marie anytime, any place. So it's good. Thank you.
Well, we're happy to have you, Heidi and Marie, of course, and all of our lovely panelists today, Daniel, Jennifer, Lisa, and Michael. Thank you all so much for joining us today, sharing your knowledge and experiences in today's panel discussion. And thank you to all of the attendees who joined today. Like you said, Heidi, they had some fantastic questions today that really helped our conversation. So a quick reminder to join us on April 26th for our second panel discussion in the series, Getting Started with Curriculum Mapping. This series is brought to you by Chalk. Chalk is a planning and analytics platform that enables K-12 schools and districts to develop a cohesive, standards-aligned map for curriculum and instruction. To learn more about Chalk or to get support on your curriculum initiatives, please visit chalk.com/demo. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.